Hello and welcome to PFI Talks, brought to you by Prague Finance Institute, an affiliate of the leading Czech economics research center Sergej Yai. My name is Leoš Rusek. I'm the head of communications at PPF Group and the host of this podcast. It is my great pleasure to welcome William Goetzmann, a professor of finance and management studies at Yale University. Mr. Goetzmann is the author and co-author of many books on finance, including Money Changes Everything. But he isn't into studying finance only. He digs deeper. Literally, I mean it literally. One of his passions is archaeology, and that's what we are going to talk about too. Hello, Professor.
Hello.
I'm going to segue from my intro. When I was preparing for this podcast, it was not only about, reminiscing about reading your book and going through it again. I just came across that you are also, or have been, or still are, tell me more about it, into archaeology. How is that true? And what do you do about archaeology?
Well, I love to talk about archaeology. I was an archaeology major when I was an undergraduate, and I did many excavations and summers, and then after I finished my college, I worked as a field archaeologist. So. That's a foundation of my education and early career interests. So, it's just simply exciting to excavate, to discover things, to try and make sense of the data that is coming out of the ground. It's quite kind of a romantic career, so I've stayed in touch with that field, with that profession, ever since that time. So over the years, my colleagues here at Yale that are in Near Eastern languages and literatures, or Chinese history, or even Pleistocene archaeology, they've been really kind about spending time with me and leading me into interesting new discoveries and helping me use the current developments in archaeology and classics and things like that to inform my research about the role of finance in society. So I know it doesn't sound like it's a match or a close discipline to financial economics, but both of those fields study human behavior, and they both use data, and they're both fields where you are always, if you're lucky, always discovering new things and new things about human nature and human behavior.
Yeah, and talking about that, human nature and behavior is very closely linked to trade, using money, and all sorts of financial instruments, obviously. Let's move on into the main subject of our discussion, and that's finance. I mean, reading your book, it came out in 2016, if I remember it correctly. What do you think is the most sort of appreciated or underappreciated financial innovations in humankind's history?
Well, things can be underappreciated if they're ubiquitous and we just don't pay attention to them and don't think about why they're fundamentally important. I have a list of those things in my mind, but I think probably the simplest one would be bonds. Mm-hmm. We think about buying bonds as a somewhat boring activity, and that we know they're used by the governments to raise money. But the innovation, the first innovation, the first time bonds were created, they were municipal bonds. They were the bonds that were issued by the Republic of Venice, and they were not conceived originally as such. They were just short-term loans that turned into permanent promises, and they go back into the Middle Ages. But the reason that they're so important, the reason why the ability of governments and corporations, for that matter, to issue debt is that it transfers value across time. So, a bond is a promise of future payments. So that just forces you to think about money that will be coming in the future. And it's also a technology that brings money right now into the present. So a house can be bought, a new invention can be developed by a corporation, or a government can fund crucial activities. So that transfer of value through time is so fundamental that we have to keep reminding ourselves that it's not something that just always happens. There were cultures that for centuries just didn't use this time transfer tool, this tool of a bond. And so it just led to different strategies for government finance, for example.
But when you mention bonds, obviously that existed even before the bonds. I mean, so is the innovation of bonds more in that they become tradable or sort of exchangeable rather than just...
Well, that's an excellent question, because you're right. The ability to strike a deal to create a loan between two people and create exact circumstances about that loan and exact quantities and so forth, that existed at least back into the Mesopotamian era. So let's say 5,000 years, we've probably had, well, at least that length of time, recorded contracts for delivery in the future and borrowing into the present. But the innovation of the bonds is that it created a standard kind of contract that was a contract that was fungible. Mm-hmm. So the concept of fungible versus non-fungible in the modern era, I find really interesting. Fungibility means you don't care which of the bonds that you have. If you and I both have some bonds and you want to buy one from me, you don't really care which one it is, because they're just they're identical mm-hmm. from the perspective of their use and value. So that fungibility meant that meant two things. The first thing is that people understood broadly what they were. You didn't have to investigate every specific loan to try and understand what the terms are. But it also created a broadly accessible savings vehicle for people who have a lot of wealth and very little wealth, because very rich people could buy thousands of bonds, and poorer people could buy one bond, but they're essentially the same kind of claim and understood as such, and that allowed also the ability to buy and sell, and when your circumstances change your investment portfolio. So they're very flexible technology that were created by the Venetian Republic, and then adopted within Europe over the next century or two by many different cities, because it created a demand for savings vehicles that was latent and may not have been completely appreciated by potential borrowers. So it kickstarted a whole technology of savings by individuals and financing of government enterprise by sovereigns.
And if we were to fast forward to our contemporary times, or modern times, if you will, aren't we at the sort of a potentially an end of that development journey, that the current economic systems, financial systems are simply too complicated to actually, appreciate the good simplicity and the reliability of the original bond, if I may put this into that perspective?
The question you're asking is something that plagued people following the global financial crisis, because the global financial crisis came about at a time when mortgage-backed securities, and what I mean by that is mortgages that were packaged into other forms and then sliced up or segregated into different pieces and sold off to different types of investors, and it was very complicated. For one of these mortgage-backed securities that were issued during the global financial crisis, you might have a document explaining all the terms and the risks that went on for 900 pages. So that's just a perfect example of the shocking complexity that modern finance has gotten to. And in some sense, that complexity was blamed for the general failure to understand the grave risks that were confronted when you have a transformative technology that may not have been stress tested in the way that it was in 2008 and 2009. But, whenever I think about these complexities, I think about the complexities of the modern electronic technology that we have. I mean, you may be more knowledgeable about this than I am, but if I open up first of all, I can't even open my iPhone, but if I could, there's no way I could understand the complexities of this. I think about modern finance similarly. Finance is a technology, a set of tools, and people have been very clever throughout the centuries in refining that technology in the same way that we've been able to refine and innovate in the field of electronics or biochemistry or any one of a number of fields. So, for better for worse, in the modern world, we rely almost entirely on the brilliance and innovation and technical skills of others. Same in the world of finance.
Well, thanks for actually mentioning iPhone. And, since we are into books, there's an amazing book that just came out, and it's about Apple in China. And there's a great deal of them. A big chunk of that book is actually devoted to how iPhones in China, not when it comes to their production, but they were sort of re-imported into China and became sold in China through the sprawling authorized resellers and eventually a few Apple stores. The iPhones themselves, they turned into a financial instrument because lots of people were buying them for immediate reselling into other parts of China where this product was coveted. Anyway, so my question is, do you think that without all these financial innovations, starting with credit bonds and everything, the innovation that we appreciate in physical world would be stalled or simply impossible?
Well, the answer has got to be, in some measure, yes, but not entirely, because, of course, financial tools like the issuing of equity shares. So the stock market as a setting for the issuance of equity shares, or even more recently, the development of venture capital funds in order to invest in risky innovations. That has made possible the rapid acceleration of technological innovation in many different fields. So you can think about it as sharing not just risk across a lot of different investors, but also sharing opportunities. So when you mention Apple, um, you know, we can all own shares in Apple and take advantage of the innovations that the company introduced and the financial benefits that accrue from those. So I would say it's certainly true that finance is an important cofactor, not a driver, but an important additional technology that makes possible advances in the real world, the real economic world. And even though finance has been thought of as kind of an abstraction, a exploitative technology sometimes, and so forth, think about it as plumbing. Plumbing is there to make buildings work better, to make urban settings feasible, to allow us to live in large cities and so forth. But it's not the focus of what we are, what the city is doing. It's just something that helps. So, unless without good plumbing, we wouldn't be able to have cities of millions of people. And without financial technology, we wouldn't be able to sustain global growth.
Well, my following question, you have already answered it, but I still want to ask you that because I want that question to be said or to be heard. And it's do you think that without proper financial markets and proper financial instruments well developed, there couldn't be a dominant nation, there couldn't be an empire built? Or does it or is it irrelevant because you just said it's financial instruments and financial services are cofactors in all that, economic intermediation?
Well, I will say that there may be some interesting counterexamples. And well, one of them is the example of China. So throughout China's history, China has been an innovator in certain kinds of financial technologies, but one of the glaring gaps in China's financial toolkit for many years until the last 100 years or so was China didn't have an active bond market. So all of the benefits that we discussed about bonds earlier, China lived without, and yet China was able to maintain a vast, extended empire for millennia. So how did it do that without this capacity to government capacity to borrow immediately to solve problems like fight wars and deal with natural disasters and so forth? China had to have a different financial technology in order to bring value from the future into the present, and it was limited to some extent in its capacity to do that. China traditionally, when I say traditionally, go back 200 or 300 years, the government itself, in order to mitigate those risks of needing sudden inflows of revenue, China, the government, was a government that saved. So you can replace borrowing with having enough cash on hand when it might be needed. So there was this savings from the government as a saver as opposed to a borrower. That is a distinction that you can apply to, let's say, the Western European financial tradition versus the Eastern Chinese tradition. So, and then of course we can think of other settings where problems of risk sharing and benefit sharing may have existed without explicit contracting tools. Although there, it's hard to imagine a society that can grow and encompass more and more people that don't know each other well without having some way of enforcing equity and sharing responsibilities through some financial set of tools.
Looking back at the history of finance, would there be a similar example to something like we have witnessed over the past, let's say, 2-3 decades, and it's regarding Germany? You know, Germany is undisputedly one of the biggest economies in the world, one of the biggest exporters in the world, but because of whatever its history of like hyperinflation going back to the 20s and everything, 1920s, it actually up until the Eurozone creation has never really played a big role in finance on the global level, if I may put it this way. So I've always sort of wondered that how the German economy has succeeded to actually build up on outsourcing, creating, getting to that global level of becoming a global player in the financial markets, as much as the euro could aspire to be one of the global players. It's not as dominant as the dollar, for sure. So are there any similar examples of that sort of outsourcing, if I may put it this way?
I can think of historical examples, but your question about Germany really makes me think about modern Germany as a product of let's say modern Germany. Let's take Germany over the last 100 years and think about the extraordinary financial shocks and transitions and restructurings and that have gone over. That's just a few generations of Germans that started out. Somebody might have been born in a period of hyperinflation, and then lived through the period of a German. A post-war German financial reorganization. They had to live through how you had a country that was separated in two, that had debt outstanding, and then what did you do when they came back together? Then this Eurozone experiment was pretty extraordinary, and Germany found a role in that. That helped define its economy, but then all of a sudden, this shock of disparate needs from Southern Europe and Northern Europe, and the Greek financial crisis also caused Germany to reflect and reflect on its policy. So it just seems to be one of the most tumultuous histories that financial histories that one could imagine over the last century. So when you say, well, are there other kind of examples of that? I think that we can certainly look back at, when you look at Europe, it's distinguished from China by being broken up into a lot of different countries with a lot of different experiments that took place, and a lot of different financial paths, trajectories. And so each one of the major currencies in Europe before the euro had its own story about why it happened to evolve in that way. Of course, the British pound is an interesting example, and fundamentally tied to the creation of the strong central bank and the right that bank had from the 17th century onwards to be able to issue money. Now, you also brought up the issue of borrowing rather than inventing, and the example that comes to mind there is Meiji, Japan. The history of Japan is so interesting because in the early 19th century, you could imagine that it was almost a feudal society and resistant to interacting with the outside world. And then during the Meiji period, Japan said actively took steps to try and find financial models that would work for it. And there, it didn't turn to the United States. It turned to the German financial system. It created a central bank modeled on the German banking system. It seemed rational to them, and it seemed like it might fit their economy, and so they very consciously borrowed in that way. China also tried to import and adapt financial technologies, not from Germany, although there were parts of China that were virtually colonized. Shandong, for example, by German enterprise, but it had a long-term relationship with the British due to the Opium Wars and the conflicts around that. But at the same time, the trade with the British into the treaty ports in China allowed Chinese entrepreneurs and financiers to learn how the British were able to issue stocks and bonds and finance railroads and use a capital market in order to build their economy and build their industry. So starting in, I think it was 1863, perhaps, anyway, the 1860s, China started to experiment with European-style, British-style finance, as opposed to what was thought of in Japan as a financial structure based on a central bank. The Chinese experiments were quite successful in bringing in capital to build railroads in China, but it also raised big social problems because of the demands that financiers had to pay for these far-flung transportation systems in a country that wasn't Great Britain. So those dynamics, financial expediency, can lead to real social conflicts that manifested themselves in the modern history of China.
Well, it may seem like it's not related, but it all is, because everything is really about education, learning from one another. So moving back to closer Europe, going further back into the history to ancient Greece. In your book, you, if I may put it this way, you seem very appreciative of a conscious, what we would call like a financial literacy policy of the ancient Greeks. I mean, could you elaborate on that? And are there any lessons to be learned? Any learnings for us for today?
Yes, I can think of some lessons, but let me tell you a little bit about my experience there. People have written about Greece, the origins of banking in Greece, for example, and found wonderful textual evidence of the class of banking emerging in classical Athens. But the thing that struck me as I began almost as a novice to read in this academic literature is the fact that somebody we would call the first lawyer, Demosthenes, an orator and a politician, his, I would say, records of his court cases are extant. And from those, you can get a wonderful slice of life, a picture. It's almost as if, today we might be watching a television series about a court battle, and suddenly you're in the courtroom, you're seeing these people arguing, you're looking at who the jury is. Same thing from these Demosthenes texts. So as I was reading through them, what struck me is that, first of all, they're very sophisticated when it comes to describing financial arguments. And so, for example, when Demosthenes sued his uncles because they cheated him out of his inheritance, he used financial arguments that ranged from calculating the cash flow that the last 10 years of his inheritance should have provided, to evaluating the cash equivalent of the companies that his father had started, and that what they should be worth. So those are the arguments that we use today for valuing enterprise. Demosthenes, in classical Athens, those are the tools he was using. Well, that seems like he was a smart guy. However, what struck me is that the people that he was appealing to were jurors in Athens. They weren't specialized, they weren't lawyers themselves, they weren't financiers. They were people that were sitting there trying to decide, based on his argument, who was right and who was wrong. So the fact that I had to use a pen and paper and figure out what the values are that he was describing and how much he was cheated out, that told me that the jurors were clever enough to follow his financial arguments for present value of future cash flows and equivalent asset values. And that means that they were really sophisticated. So you thought, well, maybe there was a special court. No, there was not a special court. Well, it was a merchant court, but the jurors were people that were drawn at random from the Athenian citizenry. And sometimes as many as 300 or 400 jurors sat for one day and listened to the arguments, and then another set would come in on the next day. So if you can imagine being a juror in Athens and being called to listen to these complex financial arguments time and time again, that is, you might as well be getting an MBA in finance. So that was what struck me, the sophistication of the listeners, not the sophistication of the lawyers.
But have you found any evidence of them actively, getting that expertise before they were called on to serve on the jury, as jurors?
Well, I guess you're asking me about what do we know about the educational system in classical Athens. And of course, we think about the philosophers, and we think about the lofty topics that are discussed in the symposia and, those kind of things. We do know that we know enough about the other kinds of operations that were taking place. The business operations, that whether you learned in school or you learned or you learned through apprenticeship, or you, for that matter, even learned through an enslavement process. We know that the business operations were certainly as sophisticated as those lawsuits would have suggested, which is the ability to calculate values, to assess risk, and other things that you need to do to run a successful operation. For example, Demosthenes' father had two businesses. One of them made furniture, like beds and things like that, for wealthy people who could afford to encrust them with ivory and other decorative features. But he had to have an understanding of profit and loss statements, how much those raw materials would cost. There then he also had a sword making operation, a weapon operation, which had the same kind of features to it. So, we don't think of the Athenians as a nation of shopkeepers like we do the British or the Americans, but it seems that many of them were. They were very much a business. Many of the citizens were very much engaged in business. Some of the most interesting businesses were mining operations, because near Athens was a great silver resource in a place called Laurion, and there we might together start a bid on a place to mine silver in Laurion, and the government, we'd have to get a government contract, but we'd have to assess the risk of whether or not we might find silver in that place, and then what is the uncertainty associated with it, how much we're willing to spend to buy that, to buy those mining rights. That's exactly the kind of sophisticated risk-based evaluation that goes on in the modern world today. So I'm impressed that they were able to run these businesses and assess those kinds of risks. And I'm also kind of shocked that when we think about Athens, we don't think about those. We think about it as the home of democracy, the place of these great religious structures. We think about its wars, but we don't really appreciate that it was a place where, driven by trade, sophisticated in finance, and a city that actually relied fundamentally on wide, far-flung trade just to be able to feed its populace. And that, again, is a kind of a financial wonder that made Athens possible.
So, with that thought on mind, and that kind of perspective, what are your thoughts about the latest, if you will, sort of financial innovations? To my liking, we talk a lot about the AI. So let's add something to the AI. Is AI going to play some sort of a role in financial innovations? What about digital currencies? Bitcoin. Or is there anything else that we're actually bringing to the table, or is it just a sort of a new packaging of the same old thing?
We can always think about what problems the new technology actually solves. And most of those problems are age-old problems that financial tools have solved in the past. So we can think about, for example, the blockchain as a modern replacement for many of the accounting tools that have existed since the beginning of recorded history. I'll give you an example. One of the problems that you have when you want to contract for something that's future delivery is the concern that the two parties may try and alter the contract between now and the time, let's say, that you've promised to deliver 1,000 bushels of wheat. That's a futures contract. That's a forward contract today, and we have markets and legal structure to support that. But how do you stop somebody from cheating? How do you prove that we both agreed today to make a transfer in the future? If we go back 3,000 years, the Sumerian society in what's now southern Iraq addressed this problem, but even before they could write, by saying, well, let's represent the bushels of wheat with the little clay, little clay piece that symbolizes the wheat. We could put 10 in there for each 100 bushels of wheat. and then let's put it inside of a clay ball, and then we'll seal up the ball, and then we will put our signatures on the outside of the ball with, they had their own ways of using signatures. And then we let the ball dry. So we have this clay technology. The ancient plains of Sumer they were not lush. They didn't have a lot of stone. They had to make many things out of clay. So they made these things called bulle, which could be used for contracting. We put in how many things that we plan to deliver. We sign the thing, we let it dry, and then nobody can poke a hole in there to put another 10 bushels of wheat, or 10 indications of wheat. You have to crack the ball open, and you both look at these things, and presumably in the witnesses will all see, you can count them up and it's 10. That was a technology. When you think of modern blockchain, what is important about the blockchain? You can create a contract, then you register it on the blockchain, and it can't be changed. It's the same concept. That's a wonderful technology for irreversible contract creation. And so whether it's in pieces of clay or it's in the cloud and maintained in multiple sources so that one person is not in control of the blockchain and can switch around, nevertheless, it solves a fundamental problem about this transfer of value through time and the concerns about trust that are implicit in that.
So, what would be your outlook for the U.S. financial markets and economy at the current, given the current circumstances, tariffs, threats of global trade wars and sort of and all that stuff, and all what we see from Europe, some even tensions at universities, how does it affect, for example, financial education at such a high level like universities? So what is your current outlook on the U.S. economy and high finance learning at university level in the U.S.?
Let me start with the fact that I can get myself into a total panic about the state of the modern world, as everybody can. But that is human nature, to focus on the urgency and concerns about what can go wrong and how wrong it can go. Some of the work I've been doing recently in behavioral finance, very simple thing, has been to look at the frequency of the use of and attention to historical events in newspapers. And what strikes me is that those historical events are far and away the most common historical event is some disaster. So when you see something about history in the newspaper, it's often something that has to do with global financial crisis or even natural disasters. So we are tuned as humans to think about what disastrous things that can go wrong and use the past as a potential model for the future. So I want to just let's recall the 100 years that Germany of past German history and all of the disasters that you can point to in the politics of Germany, the finance of Germany, the personal stress that German people have gone through. And, Germany survives right now. And same thing with the United States. When people say, is the 21st century going to be better? What's going to happen in the 21st century? My view is, when we think about, let's just focus for a minute on being investors. When I think about what investors globally experienced in the 20th century, two unprecedented, massive global wars, the bifurcation of the world into two different economic and political systems. The extraordinary changes in technology for good and ill. Look at the returns to stocks and bonds globally over the last 125 years. Well, in many cases, there has been, in many cases, the stock markets mostly survived. Of course, there were some dramatic failures and interruptions, but somehow I have a feeling that the financial systems, at least, will mend themselves, will be robust, or maybe rely on governments to mend them. So I'm less concerned about whether or not my life savings invested in financial instruments is going to disappear or be eaten up by hyperinflation. I probably would be more concerned about how societies are likely to evolve going forward, and what the chances of what the human toll that wars might take on the world, rather than the fear that somehow the financial systems are going to be eliminated.
Well, my last question is it's more personal. I mean, your father, William Harry Goetzmann, was a historian. How has that affected your career choice or studies or influenced your writing? Oh, I should say, how has he?
Yeah. Yes, my father was a historian, and he worked in several different areas, mostly American history, but also the history of exploration, but also intellectual history. So I had a chance to really see how the academic world and the academic mind works. And I guess I learned the craft of academic research from my father. That I understood that the life of the mind was a wonderful life if you're a person with a lot of curiosity and want to understand things. Another thing that I got from my father was an interest in the very longue durée of history. How did things evolve from the very beginning? Where did things start? So a historian might ask, where does democracy start? I asked, where does present value start? Where do financial tools start? So that got me looking very immediately. I started to look into the early history of things, the ancient history of things, and then try and understand the role that financial tools played in the evolution of society. But those really derive from my experience of my father bringing his work home with him, being willing to talk about fairly sophisticated models of human interaction, and introducing me to a lot of history. So it was a great foundation for my career.
Says Professor William Goetzmann. Thank you for being with us today, sharing your insights, and I hope we will have a chance to talk more, and maybe I will try to sort of influence my colleagues and come up with a maybe Czech translation of your wonderful book. That would be great. Thank you very much, sir.
I appreciate it. Thanks for your great questions.
And to our listeners and viewers, it's been great that you tuned in, and see you next time.